Enlisting in a militia, fleeing the country to escape the law, sawing your way out of jail cells, or shooting a man for snoring. Being an outlaw in the Wild West was no easy ride. Oh, and did I mention they robbed banks and trains for a living? And maybe the occasional horse. Oft orphaned or living alone from youth, criminal outlaws like Billy the Kid, John Wesley Hardin, Belle Starr, the James Younger Gang, and the Wild Bunch would become folkloric figures in American history and culture. Welcome to History on Fleek. Today we examine the lives of Wild West Outlaws. Probably the most famous of Wild West Outlaws and an endlessly romanticized figure was Jesse James. Born on September 5, 1847, Missouri-born James would join the Confederate guerrilla group the Bushwhackers with his brother Frank. Before he'd even begun a career of bank and train robberies, the James name was notorious for their role in the Centralia Massacre and brutality upon Union soldiers. However, it was following the Civil War that Jesse James and his brother Frank formed the James Younger Gang. In 1866, the gang would conduct one of the very first daylight bank robberies in U.S. peacetime, stealing $60,000 in cash and bonds from the Clay County Savings Association in Missouri. While all the gang members were Missourian, their daring and often brutal raids covered a central stretch of the entire country. Robbing stagecoaches and banks, the gangs robbed in Iowa, Kansas, Texas, and West Virginia. Due to the public notoriety of outlaw gangs at the time, the gang was as brazen as they were brutal. They were alleged to have often committed their stick-ups in front of watching crowds, more often than not, playing up the spectacle for their onlookers. Across the 1870s, the gang would specialize in train robberies, redeeming themselves ever so slightly with a lower body count than their previous endeavors. Yet despite public admiration, the authorities were not such fans. On a fateful day in 1876, the gang was nearly laid waste by gunfire and arrests, following an attempted bank robbery in Northfield, Minnesota. Following this, each year, the authorities closed in on the gang. In a touch of pure lyricism, it would be a member of his gang who would cost Jesse James his life. Robert Ford shot Jesse James on April 3, 1882. Ford, a recruit to the gang, had hoped he'd be granted a reward and amnesty for his action. Robert Ford was tried, sentenced to hanging, and pardoned in one day flat, and soon on the run from Missouri. The public was split between sympathy for the killer and sympathy for the killed, though quite amazingly, stories began that Jesse James had survived. The claims were tested some 100 years later in 1995 when James's body was exhumed. Though the claims were proven false, the legacy of Jesse James has clearly survived. Billy the Kid was one of the most iconic Wild West outlaws despite only making it to the age of 21. Born Henry McCarty in 1859 to Irish parents in New York City, McCarty would soon be on his own for life. Both his parents would die, leaving McCarty an orphan at 15, and a life of single-minded desperation would follow. His first arrest came a year later in 1875 for stealing food to eat. After a further arrest for robbing a Chinese laundry, the formative Billy the Kid would flee south, moving through New Mexico Territory and Arizona Territory. With this, the young McCarty became a federal fugitive and began his career as an outlaw. Just 16 years into his life, McCarty was on wanted posters, defining in print his moniker of Billy the Kid. Billy the Kid would make his way to New Mexico as a cattle rustler, having fled Arizona from his wanted man status. An argument with a local blacksmith led to a brawl in which McCarty fired his revolver in self-defense, felling the blacksmith. He was apprehended by law enforcement but managed to escape to the next territory. In this nomadic, drifting existence, McCarty was recruited by the regulators of Lincoln County. Fatefully, his part in the Lincoln County War of 1878 left him with another 3 murders to his name, including the county sheriff, William J. Brady. McCarty would hand himself in to the Lincoln County authorities. He would testify in court, but after several weeks of custody, the outlaw was off again, escaping from the Lincoln County Jail in 1879. By 1880, Billy the Kid was name-splashed across print press in the states of Las Vegas, New Mexico, and New York. McCarty had managed to keep his profile low as possible until the next gunfight. Joe Grant arrived in New Mexico in January 1880 with rumors abounding he intended to kill Billy the Kid. The two met one another. McCarty admired and asked to examine Grant's revolver. In a flash, Grant pointed the gun at McCarty's head, pulling the trigger but firing no bullet. In return, Billy the Kid took his shot and did so with a loaded chamber. Billy the Kid was on the run again, this time with a $500 bounty on his head from the New Mexico Territory governor. Despite the bright light with which the name Billy the Kid illuminated the public imagination, this outlaw legend would die in the dark. On July 14, 1881, returning to a friend's abode, Billy the Kid entered a darkened room with nothing but a shadowy figure sitting in silence opposite. Before he could realize the gravity of the moment, 2 revolver shots rang out, leaving Billy the Kid on the ground, bleeding out from above the heart. Pat Garrett, the man who shot Billy the Kid, would receive his $500 reward. But he'd killed a popular outlaw at a time of popular outlaws. Public attitudes felt Billy the Kid had been ambushed and preyed upon. Garrett went as far as releasing his own book to defend himself. Once labeled a queen of Oklahoma outlaws, Belle Starr was arguably the most feared of the Wild West's women, alongside Calamity Jane. The young May Belle had a prosperous beginning in Missouri and provided a formal education at a private academy, no less. Yet following the Civil War and the loss of her brother in the conflict, May Belle moved with her family to Texas, where her legend began. She was famed for style and panache, riding side saddle, often completely dressed in black, carrying pistols in both hands. Yeah! May Belle's life gathered increasing pace. Her husband, James C. Reed, turned criminal and was a wanted man for a murder in Arkansas. Following engagement with several gangs, Reed was killed in 1874 in Paris, Texas, and Belle faced arrest for a stagecoach robbery that same year. Belle's outlaw life would really begin with her marriage to Sam Starr, a Cherokee man who she settled with on Indian territory with her family in 1880. Through this union, Belle became wise to the ways of bootlegging, horse thievery, and even the bribing of the law when necessary. Evidently, the illegal enterprise was part of the newlyweds' living, and just 3 years later, the law would be hot on their trail. Both Belle and Sam would be arrested and tried for horse theft in 1883 at Fort Smith, Arkansas. Despite only a 9-month stay at a correctional facility for Belle, this proved the beginning of the end for this outlaw. 3 years later, in 1886, Belle would avoid a theft charge but lose her husband Sam to a gunfight with his cousin, no less. The last 24 months or so of Belle Starr's life were a mix of rumor and legend, salacious gossip about potential suitors, and her outlaw reputation. Outstanding, however, is her death, which to this day remains a mystery. Belle Starr was killed on February 3, 1889, just 2 days before she would turn 41. Riding home on her horse, she was ambushed and blasted with a shotgun twice. Some legends say she was killed with her own gun. Some legends say Edgar J. Watson did the deed after having been declined for a dance by Belle earlier that evening. Some legends say her own son may have killed her due to a disagreement about his mistreatment of her horse. Legends say many things, and the truth may never be known. Born Robert Leroy Parker in April 1866, a career of train and bank robbing would cement him in the cultural imagination as Butch Cassidy, leader of the Wild Bunch. The name was chosen from a youth spent an apprenticeship of a butcher in Wyoming. It is said to have also been inspired by a cattle thief who Parker worked for in his youth named Cassidy. Fleeing his home as a teenager, Parker's first criminal offense was marked with a tinge of teenage rebellion. Parker broke into a clothier, stealing a pair of jeans and some food, leaving an IOU, promising to pay on his return. Lucky for Parker, the jury he stood before acquitted him of his charges, but this was merely the beginning of a career in crime. Some 9 years later, Cassidy had clearly come to terms with what he wanted from the world and his life. Cattle and horse theft, and even some horse racing across the 1800s was not enough for Butch Cassidy. In 1889, he robbed the Telluride-based San Miguel Valley Bank. The sum total was equivalent to over $600,000 in today's money, and was enough for Cassidy to buy his own ranch in Wyoming. Yet despite all the upsides crime could provide, the downsides remained. Come 1894, Cassidy would spend 18 months in jail for horse theft in Wyoming State Prison. Upon his release, Butch Cassidy formed the Wild Bunch, a wide circle of criminals who would join his bank and robbing exploits. One of whom was named Harry Alonzo Longabaugh, but you probably know him as the Sundance Kid. From 1896 to 1901, the Wild Bunch was prolific, robbing in Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico. Yet with each robbery, their reputation grew, leading to ever-growing manhunts. Cassidy arguably dug his own grave, however, with a false pledge for amnesty from the Utah governor in 1899. The arranged meet was soiled by Cassidy, train robbing instead of attending. Just 2 years later, with many of the Wild Bunch dead or arrested, Butch Cassidy fled the country to sail to Argentina. Cassidy would find honest work in South America, but old habits die hard. In November of 1908, near a small mining town in Bolivia, a courier for a mining company was robbed. When the local authorities apprehended and killed the two masked bandits, they were revealed to be Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Nothing like running it till the wheels fall off, huh? One of the fastest draws in the West was outlaw John Wesley Hardin. Forever an outlaw, Hardin was dealing with the law at the age of 15. Born on May 26, 1853, Hardin began his life on the wrong side of the law, nearly expelled from his school for stabbing a fellow student. Though in November 1868, Hardin would cross a threshold from which he could never return. Having challenged and beaten his uncle's former slave in a wrestling match, the next day, Hardin shot the man 5 times. Following the man's death, Hardin went into hiding from Union soldiers. When the 3 soldiers discovered him, Hardin disposed of the soldiers with a double-barreled shotgun and a revolver. The rest of his life would be that of a man on the run. As a fugitive, Hardin would litter Texas with gunfights, arrests, imprisonment, and escapes. His travails included murdering the Waco, Texas city marshal, murdering several cowboys who attempted his arrest, and escaping from Gonzales County Jail by cutting through the bars with a smuggled hacksaw. During his life on the run, he crossed paths with legendary outlaw Wild Bill Hickok. As Abilene, Kansas town marshal, Hickok confronted Hardin over his brandishing of pistols. The two were said to have had a stare down, but it never led to a legendary duel. Hardin met his end in El Paso, Texas in 1895. A night in a saloon playing dice turned sour, and John Wesley Hardin was shot in the head for his troubles. Buried 3 days later, his legend lives on. Hardin's reputation was not just as an outlaw and a fast draw, but as an exceptionally mean one, no less. His legend grew from a story he may have once shot a man for snoring. Though in his defense, this was long before nose spray or lavender pillows. This is History on Fleek, and we'll see y'all next time.